All right. Tier 2 is interesting. I thought tier 2 would be a 1-man tier, Dave. It is a 3-man tier. Who is tier 2 at tight end?
Mark Andrews is at the top, and I think he's obviously going to go ahead of the other 2 tight ends after him. You could easily you can give him his own tier. I think he's worth a round 3 pick. He's been a very good tight end for a long time. And every other year of his career besides 2021, he's been between 11.6 and 13.4 PPR points per game. So not quite 15. He was at 17.2 in that magical 2021 season when he did better without Lamar Jackson than with Lamar Jackson. He's the consolation prize for the fantasy manager who wants to draft Kelsey but just can't. Because Kelsey gets taken in front of him. There's nothing you can do to get Kelsey. Jamie takes Kelsey at 5.
Who else is in the tier? Did you say who else was in the tier?
I did not. It's Hockenson and Pitts behind him. It wouldn't surprise me if they all wound up pretty close to each other in PPR points per game when the season's over. But Andrews has more upside and is probably a lot safer than the other 2.
Jamie, do you think Mark Andrews should have his own tier?
I do. I think, again, not to go back to what we've talked about with running backs and receivers, you kind of do this exercise a little bit different, in terms of how many players you want to put in a tier. But I do think at this position, it's pretty clear. There's a 1, there's a 2, there's probably 4 guys you could say it could be the 3, and then it's kind of everybody else. So I think, yes, Kelsey's in a tier by himself, Andrews in a tier by himself. I don't disagree with Dave that they could be close by the end of the season, but they're not going to be drafted that way. And so I would approach it as if I'm looking at Kelsey round 1, I'm looking at Andrews back into round 2, early round 3, and then round 5 is where I start to look for everybody else.
Do you guys take Mark Andrews over? I think we talked about this group of wide receivers yesterday. It was Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, and Chris Olave.
No.
But the next group, yes.
I would take him over Olave, but that's it.
Well, Jamie, if you're saying you're considering Mark Andrews in late round 2, you're probably not, though. You're probably.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. Yeah, I would take those receivers ahead of him, except for Olave as well.
Okay. All right. So Andrews over Olave?
I would take Andrews over Olave, yes.
Okay. All right. So I think we should just group tiers 2 and 3 together here. Because Jamie would have Mark Andrews in his own tier. I'm curious, Dave, is how the way you went about separating tiers 2 and 3 with Hockenson and Pitts in a higher tier than Kittle, Goddard, and Waller. As really, I've spoken about tight ends so much, but not as much with you guys. I feel like it's been with Jacob or Chris or Dan or something like that. And I feel like we've sort of said, at least Chris and Dan, Hockenson, Pitts, Kittle, Goddard, Waller could be in any order. No need to. Why would you take the first one in this group? It felt like a huge tier to me. But you, Dave, have put Hockenson and Pitts in a tier above Kittle, Goddard, and Waller. Talk about that.
I think Hockenson and Pitts have upside to get around 12 to 13 PPR points per game. At least well, I can't use the word reliable with Pitts. I can kind of use it with Hockenson, but I can't use it with Pitts. I think that those are 2 tight ends that I would feel better about drafting than the other 3. I'm not excited about Kittle, Goddard, or Waller. And we can get into that. But I just feel like Hawkinson's safer, especially in PPR, non-PPR. In non-PPR, I think I have Pitts ahead of Hockenson, just because I think that Pitts has that kind of upside. Right. And because he's got that kind of upside in non-PPR, yes, he's got it in full PPR too. I'm okay with putting Pitts ahead of the older / little bit more touchdown needy type of tight ends, which are Kittle, Goddard. Waller, not necessarily painted with that brush, but someone that's got some serious downside based on health risk.
When you're drafting Pitts, you're just drafting for the chance of him to finally live up to his talent. So that's the hope, is that he can overcome his quarterback. He can overcome his offense. He could finally live up to what the expectations are. And those are still some huge risks involved with that. But if he does hit, we've seen what he can do from a yardage standpoint as a rookie, which is, somewhat unprecedented, to go over 1,000 yards in that season. And then who knows what would have happened last year if he stayed healthy. But obviously the quarterback scenario was not very good. Quarterback situation is still not very good. And now he's got to contend with one of the best running backs that we've seen come into the NFL in the last 10 years, on top of the fact of a coach that wants to run the ball. And it's just, it's hard to say that there's a safety factor with him, but there's just the upside factor with him that,
Correct.
Supersedes most of the guys in this position, even Travis Kelce, if Kyle Pitts were to probably play to his potential.
So, Jamie, do you see a separation at any point between those 5 tight ends, Hockenson, Pitts, Waller?
I don't know.
No, you think they're in the same tier?
Yes, I do. I think, they're not going to be drafted the same way, but I think for me, I have a hard time keeping Waller from being the 3rd tight end, just because I think if he does stay healthy, he's going to beat Hockenson, Pitts, Kittle, and Goddard. I think there's just that opportunity is there for him. You see what this receiving core looks like. I mean, Adam, you were trying to convince me about Paris Campbell being a somewhat relevant player for the Giants, which makes sense, given the injuries. But again, that's part of it. Wan'Dale Robinson's hurt, and Isaiah and Sterling Shepard's hurt. And so we know what the middle of the field has been to Daniel Jones. Isaiah Hodgins, had a great finish last year. Darius Slayton had some very positive moments last year that probably underrated, but those guys are just, I think, guys. And Darren Waller was their prize acquisition this offseason. And again, when he's been healthy, superstar. So if he stays healthy, probably going to have a monster season. It's just a matter of, can you buy into it after 2 years of him not being healthy? So I love the setup for him. I think if he hits, he's better than Hockenson, he's better than Pitts, he's better than Kittle, he's better than Goddard.
By the way, what I said to Jamie, I texted him. I said, Jamie, I have a sleeper for you. I can't say it on the show because it's so unlikely, but if it hits, you'll have to give me public credit for it. So that's always the best way to set it up, right? Because if it doesn't hit, no one's ever going to know. Right. And then I said it was Paris Campbell. So
but now it's out there.
Now it's out there. If Paris Campbell hits, I want the credit. If it doesn't hit, I never intended for anyone to hear it. This is Jamie's fault. All right. So Dave, try to explain a little bit more why you're not as high on that group of Kittle, Goddard, Waller, why you don't view them in the same tier. I know you touched on, I think you kind of talked about it more from the two who are in the better tier, Pitts and Hockenson, but let's maybe more focus now on Kittle, Goddard, and Waller.
It's all about upside and which ones have it and which ones don't. And you can make the case that Kittle, Goddard, and Waller all do have upside. I'll start with Goddard. I think he's the safest of the 3. We've seen him play the majority of games of those 3. Yeah, he got hurt last year. It's going to happen to all players where injuries come and go. But he's not the number 1 target in the Philadelphia offense. The Philadelphia offense isn't one that's going to pass like crazy. And yet, still, he averaged 11.8 PPR points per game last year. Year before that, when the offense wasn't even as good as it was, and they didn't have A.J. Brown, he had fewer PPR points per game. So Goddard does have appeal as like a safe tight end, not necessarily one that can get you 13 or 14 PPR points per game. He's a settle for tight end. Kittle, in his last 8 overall with Brock Purdy, including the playoffs, pretty awesome. 7 touchdowns on 7 red zone targets, 12 plus PPR in 5 of 8 games. But we've talked about what he looks like when everybody else is healthy in San Francisco. And it's ugly. With Purdy, with Debo, with Ayuk, with McCaffrey. 5 games. This includes the playoffs, but not the playoff game that Purdy got hurt in against Goddard's Eagles. It was 10 PPR points per game, 2 touchdowns, 12 plus PPR in just 2 of 5 games. Both the touchdowns came against Arizona. I am nervous that George Kittle won't be anywhere near 11 PPR points per game or 12 PPR points per game if Ayuk takes that next step, if Debo Samuel stays healthy, if Christian McCaffrey is even more involved in this offense after his first full offseason of being entrenched there. So he makes me nervous. Waller makes me the most nervous because he's missed at least 6 games each of the past 2 seasons. His pace last year in Las Vegas was 53 catches, 733 yards, and 6 touchdowns. That's not even 10 PPR points per game. I watched his last final 4 games of the regular season when he was healthy. He struggled to separate from press coverage or physical coverage, knew how to get open versus zone, still moved pretty well for a tight end, still could leap. But this is a Giants team. They were 52% pass last year, including 39% pass in the red zone. And they really liked spreading the ball around. There wasn't one guy that got a ton of targets head and shoulders above the rest.
I mean, that's why they brought in Waller, right?
Yep.
Maybe it's part of it. Listen, I like that he's a differentiator. I like that he's a differentiator in his size. Because besides Isaiah Hodgins, they don't have anybody that's got size to him. But I still don't think he's going to dominate targets week in and week out in that offense.
I do.
For whatever games that he's there for. I think they're going to spread it around. I will allow myself to change my opinion if there is no Saquon Barkley, because then I think they will throw a heck of a lot more than they did or last year with Barkley. So we'll see what that happens. And it's a tough schedule as well. They play a lot of really tough defenses. So I think the downside for Waller is greater than Goddard and is greater than Kittle. And that's why he's last for me among these five.
It's so interesting. Hawkinson is the one that's drafted third among those five after Kelsey and Andrews. Would it be fair to say that Hockenson has the fewest question marks of that group of five?
Yes.
Depends how much you buy into Jordan Addison. Because if you buy into Jordan Addison being that much better than Adam Thielen and commanding more than 100 plus targets, then it's going to be a problem for TJ Hockenson. Because again, this is a guy that had some big spike games last year, even in Minnesota, but they are going to throw the ball probably more than any of these other teams. And so that's where he sort of benefits.
Right.
So if you think there's going to be a target crunch because of whatever Addison does on top of, the numbers that went to Thielen, and then still KJ Osborne being somewhat of a factor, and then whatever they decide to do with their running backs, then Hawkinson's going to suffer a little bit. But I think he's fine. I think he's shown you enough that when he has I think capable quarterback play, offense is going to trust him. And the fact that Minnesota went out to go get him last year, they believe in what he can do, and I think fantasy managers should as well.
Okay, and the stat I keep giving about the being top 2 in targets being so important. It's pretty hard, I think, to envision that for Goddard. We sit here with everyone healthy. He should be third on targets. And
he
Kittle,
will be third.
Yeah. And Kittle probably would be too. Does that matter to you? Because like I said, there were two, that whole trend was pretty much broken last year with 2 of the top 5 being third on their team in targets, Kittle and Ingram. But how much does that matter to you? This something we look for, kind of hard to see it with Goddard, and a little bit easier, but not that easy with Kittle.
With Goddard, he had 69 targets in 12 games and only 3 touchdowns, and he still averaged 11 PPR points per game. So I'm hoping that he can be at least on that same target pace, maybe a tick higher. Maybe Philadelphia throws it a little bit more, and Goddard can stay as a pretty consistent fantasy tight end. Kittle worries me just because of everybody else who's there. I feel like he needs an injury he needs one of those other guys to miss time in order just to reemerge as the go-to touchdown target for Purdy in that offense. And maybe inside the 10, he still is when everybody's healthy. But I have a hard time believing that the targets will still be strong for him when everybody else is there.
I'll give you guys just some numbers here, because Dallas Goedert, before the injury, he was the number 3 tight end per game. He was on pace for 100 targets. And Devontae Smith was the number 35 wide receiver per game. And he was on pace for 115 targets. He just wasn't really that good with it. And then Goddard gets hurt, and they play 5 games without Goddard. Goddard comes back last 3 games of the season. Smith and Brown are great. Goddard stinks. He gets 5 targets per game. Didn't score a touchdown. It wasn't that bad. I mean, he was on pace for.
He averaged 9.3.
That was also with what? 1 game with Minshew, or both games?
2 games. 2 games with Minshew and 1 with Hurt,
including week 8,
and then an injured Jalen Hurts.
And they threw a lot. They threw 35.6 pass attempts per game, which was more than you usually see. Then in the postseason, Goddard had 18 targets in 3 games. So that's a pace of 102 targets. So I guess before his injury, on pace for 100 targets. It really didn't change that much. I think he just didn't score as many touchdowns, and Devontae Smith got so much better throughout the season. So Goddard wasn't really a standout like he was before his injury when Smith wasn't really doing much. But can he be great with 100 targets? Maybe he can. Can he get 100 targets? I don't know. 100 targets for Goddard, yay or nay?
I'll say yay.
Yeah.
All right. And then let's wrap this up here. We'll take a break and talk about the other guys, because remember, 48% of the top 5 tight ends in the last, I think I said 5 seasons have been drafted in round 10 or later. So there are a lot of relevant players we're still going to talk about. Jamie, if you don't get Kelsey or Andrews, you're content waiting for whoever's close to last in this group, right?
100%.
And Dave, you're going to be a little more aggressive? Are you going to get into the Hockenson Pitts, or are you okay?
Yeah, that's why there's that tier split for me, because I'm okay, assuming that I can get them in that basically round 5 range, which will be harder to do with Hockenson in full PPR. But if I'm getting a little bit of value on Hockenson or Pitts, I'm taking them.